So welcome everybody. This is a fun topic, and I hope it's a good diversion for people getting away from all the other wackiness that's going on around us. So I just wanted to talk about exposure tonight and exposure control. So first I wanted to start talking about the light meter and measuring light. You know, your camera has a light meter built into it, and it's measuring how much light is entering the camera and how much is being reflected off the scene that you're looking at. So in a scene like this, it's measuring the light that's bouncing into the camera. It doesn't matter where you are, if you're standing out in the sun or you're in the shade, it's what the scene that your camera is seeing. And it measures several different things. It looks at the highlights, which are the brightest parts of the picture. It looks at the shadows, which are the darker parts of the picture. And it looks at the midtones, which would be in between highlight and dark. So when it does that, it averages all the tones together. And my dog just walked in. And tries to create an 18% gray. And so when you photograph something like this fog, the meter is going to nail it exactly, because that's the tonal values it's looking to make every scene look like. But it isn't always right. So if you're photographing a black cat, it's going to say, wait, that cat shouldn't be black. It should be gray. And the picture will come out too light because the camera thinks that cat should be gray. Same thing happens on the other side. If you're photographing snow or on a sunny beach, it's going to say, wait a minute, that snow shouldn't be white, it should be gray. And thus your picture comes out too dark. So the whites aren't white, they're gray, if you're going exactly by what the meter says. So some photographers carry around gray cards, one that's 18% gray, a black card, and a white card. And if you're really picky about your exposures, you'll meter off of that gray card, and you'll have it in the light that your subject is. So again, if you're standing in the shade and your subject's in the sun, you can't hold your gray card up front of your camera in the shade and meter off of it. You have to put it out into the sunlight. So that's for people who are really picky. If you are doing product photography and the exposure has to be exactly the same as whatever you're photographing, you're probably going to meter off of a gray card, or you're going to use a handheld meter. But if you're not, you just use some exposure compensation. And there's several ways to do that. If you're using aperture priority, on your camera will be a gauge like the one you're seeing that's in yellow or green, depending on how your screen is looking. So it'll have a +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3. And at 0 is exactly where the meter says the exposure should be. As we just seen, that's not always the case. So sometimes you need to make the picture darker, so you go to -1. Or you'll need to make the picture a little brighter, you go to +1. And every camera is different, so I can't tell you exactly how to do exposure compensation on your camera, but as long as you're in an automatic mode, there's a pretty simple way to do it. So do a little research on that and get your exposure compensation setting. So it's set at +2, and that will help you change your exposure. Because if your picture is too dark and you're in aperture priority and you change the aperture from f5.6 to f4 to make it brighter, the camera's automatically going to change the shutter speed, and so your exposure is going to be exactly the same. That's why you do exposure compensation. I've done other videos on that and going into a lot more detail. But there are different metering modes that you can use. And so there are what Canon calls evaluative and Nikon calls matrix. I don't know what Sony does. I couldn't find that. They're center weighted and they're spot. There are some cameras have other ones also, but these are the three main ones that everybody uses or everybody has. And what they do is, and there's what it looks like on the back of a Canon camera. So the evaluative also has another mode on some cameras, not every camera. So that's why there's 4 options there. But what the evaluative or matrix does is essentially it looks at your entire picture for all the tone values in the picture in its entirety, and it's evaluating the whole scene. And so it will use that whole scene to determine what it says the proper exposure should be. If you're using a center weighted mode, it is only using the center of the picture to determine the exposure, figuring that, hey, your subject might be in the middle of the picture. If you're big in the rule of thirds, it probably isn't, but a lot of times it is. So center weighted might be pretty good. And we'll talk more in a few minutes about which ones to use when. There's also the spot meter mode, or yes, spot metering mode. And it is just taking a very small spot, usually out of the middle of the picture. Some cameras you can move that spot around. Some it will follow where your focus point is, but the spot meter will just go for a very, very tight space and just use that for determining what the brightness should be of your picture. Okay. So if you're photographing a woman in Cuba yanking on a cigar, which mode should you use? So in this case, wait, let me go back one. So in this case, it would use the whole picture in the evaluative or the matrix mode, right? So it's looking at the bright wall on the left, the brighter wall on the right, the woman's face, her head, her body is evaluating all of that and trying to make that an 18% gray, to average all that out to 18% gray, okay? If you're using center weighted, it's only going to look at the middle of the picture. So in this case, part of her face, part of the wall, part of her shoulder, part of her hat. That's what it will use to try to determine what the 18% gray should be. If it was a spot, it would only be going right in on the back of her neck, part of the wall. So, you know, which one was better? We'll talk more about that in a moment. So the reality is none of these did a very good job on this picture. Her face is way too dark for me. And the wall is you know, the wall is perfectly exposed, but I don't care about the wall. I only care about her face, right? So in this case, I realized my pictures are too dark. I need to brighten it up. So I changed my exposure, made the picture brighter. Now her face looks good. The wall's too bright, but I don't care about the wall. You know, her face is what's important here. So I shoot entirely in manual exposure. I don't use aperture priority. I don't use shutter priority, any of the programs, because I'm a bit of a control freak. So I know the camera is going to lie to me at least half of the time on what the proper exposure is going to be. So I am manually adjusting my exposure all the time. So when I see a scene like this, I know the camera, and so I always keep my exposure mode in the evaluative mode, or if I was Nikon, to be matrix. So it's evaluating the whole picture to figure out what the right exposure is going to be. When I see a scene like this, and I say, wait a minute, there's a pretty bright wall behind this woman who has fairly dark skin, I know right away, before I start shooting, that the picture, the exposure the camera tells me is going to be too dark, because it's going to make that white wall gray, not white, and which thus means, because there's so much white wall, and thus her face is going to be too dark. So right away I say, nah, that's not right. I know that's not going to be right. So I'm started off just a stop overexposed for what the camera told me, because I knew I wanted to have her face brighter than what the camera was telling me. And turns out I was right. Same thing happened with this guy. So these are all pictures I shot last week in Cuba. The background scene is pretty bright. So before I even pulled the camera up, I knew I had to brighten up the exposure. And so the first one is what the camera was telling me. That's what I knew it should be. So as you get more experienced, you learn what situations the camera is not telling you the proper exposure, and you can adjust that. So there's another way to adjust it, and that's called bracketing. And bracketing is simply shooting one picture at what the suggested, and I always call it suggested exposure is, one picture that's a stop underexposed and one picture that's a stop overexposed. When I'm in a real wild lighting situation, I use what I call the BLH factor, bracket like hell, and just shoot all kinds of exposures. Now, if you're going for a moment in time like this guy, you don't want to be bracketing. You know, you don't want to have to shoot 3 pictures and changing your exposure in between each one. You want to nail it right away. So in this scene, the camera was telling me, shoot it darker. It wanted it darker, and I could barely see the woman on the 2nd floor. So I had to, again, overexpose what the camera was telling me, because it was telling me it's too dark. It was just using all the information and say, make it darker. So I had to overexpose it. And if I was using aperture priority, I'd be doing that with exposure compensation. Since I'm in manual exposure, it's just a simple matter of changing my shutter speed and making it a little brighter than what it was telling me to do. When you get to a scene like this that has a wide variation of light, or a very even variation of light, it's pretty evenly lit. Any of the modes are going to do a real good job on this, because that back wall is pretty much, you know, works out to an 18% gray. In fact, the wall at the top in the back probably is 18% gray, the very top one. So when I'm shooting something like this, I'm not too worried about the exposure. I'm worried about moments in time, and just getting the moments right, and not have to worry about, is my exposure perfect. So again, the matrix or evaluative mode is what I was using for this, and it did a great job. Now, sometimes you'll get something bright in the middle, and that'll throw off your exposure a little bit. In this case, again, the matrix or evaluative mode gave me a pretty accurate suggestion of what exposure I should use, and thus worked out pretty well. Now, when you hit a contrasty scene like this, it can really throw off the exposure, because the camera has a tough time deciding, do I want, you know, does the photographer want the bricks to show up more in the shadows, or the detail in the buildings? And so as a creative tool, you have to decide, what is it that's more important, the highlights or the shadows? Because the camera can't handle all of it in really contrasty situations like this. Can't handle the total range of brightness to darkness. So I almost always go for, I meter for the highlights, meaning I make sure my highlights, my light areas of the picture, are not too bright. I don't want to lose detail in the highlights. I don't mind losing detail in the shadows. Like, you can't see any detail in the potted plants. Good. I don't want you looking at the potted plants. That's not what the picture's about. But by exposing for the highlights, I make sure I have detail in the clouds. I have detail in that very bright building. The sky looks nice. The other colors in the buildings are nice. But this is one that the camera told me, make it a lot brighter, because it was trying to make the foreground brighter too. So I had to underexpose what the camera was telling me. That happens to me quite frequently, that I have to underexpose what the camera is telling me. I know a lot of photographers who use aperture priority, and they set their camera up to be right off the bat minus a third of a stop or minus 2/3 of a stop. So everything they shoot is underexposed of what the camera is telling them, so they don't blow out the highlights. Another scene that is really tricky for the camera because there's such an area of dark versus the proper exposure. So that wall, that stucco wall, is probably about an 18% gray. So if you just metered off that wall, you'd nail this exposure. But again, I have to decide what's more important to me: the shadows, what's in the shadows, the car. Do I care what the front of that car looks like? Not at all. But I like the contrast it provides with the pretty building and the kid running past. So I want to make sure I'm holding my highlights. I don't want to blow out the color. I don't want the whites, or the, in this case, the cream color, to get too bright. So the camera is going to tell me, make this picture brighter. And I'm going to tell it, nope, I'm going to make it darker than what you're suggesting. So I'm doing that an awful lot. This was another scene that the camera was not doing too bad. The upper left part of the picture is much brighter than the lower right. So I had to make sure that I wasn't exposing for that upper left, because I wanted to maintain the proper exposure on the guys playing chess and their faces and all of that. So again, if I was spot metering, which I don't bother to do very often because one, I'm too lazy, but two, I have enough experience that I know when it's going to lie to me. So if I was spot metering, I would meter right off the ground here. And quite frequently, if I'm not sure of the exposure, I'll hold my hand up and make sure my palm is getting the same light as whatever my subject is, and meter off my palm of my hand. That tends to be about an 18% gray. Not everybody has that, but that tends to work. But in this case, that ground would be pretty much nailing the exposure here. So this is another scene where the camera was overpowered by the brightness of the light, and it was just an opportunity for me to say, okay, again, do I care about the shadows? Do I want detail in the person sitting on the bench or the person walking by with the bicycle? Answer really quick is no, I don't. I don't care about them. I like their shapes, but it was the church that caught my attention, and that's what I wanted to expose for. If I cared about the people and didn't care about the church, then the whole picture would be a lot brighter, and I'd have detail in the people, and the church would be just white and blown out and gone, and I wouldn't be getting hardly anything at all back there, just be brightness. So this one was giving me some havoc, because this was out of the room of the place I was staying, the casa, and this building next door was just falling in, and I could not believe people were living there. You can see the guy had a weight bench there, and he's ready to do some weightlifting, although I waited a half an hour and he stayed in that same position. I don't know what he was doing, but it was very contrasty light. So I had to make sure that I wasn't blowing out the highlights, and I came pretty close because I wanted to hold some detail of the building, especially the facade on the lower right, to show the crumbliness of the building. So the meter in this case was actually telling me, make the picture darker, make it darker, make it darker. And I said, no, I don't want it darker. I want it brighter. Now, how do I do that? How do I determine that and when? Well, when you're looking at, you take a picture and you look at it on the back of your camera, hopefully you can tell right away whether that's in the ballpark. I don't worry about being exact. Like I said, if I was shooting product photography, then I'd have to be exact. But I don't have to worry about being exactly right. As long as I'm pretty darn close, I can fix it in post-processing. I want to be I want it to be as close as possible in the camera so I don't have to do major corrections in post. I rarely in post change my exposure, the exposure slider in Lightroom. I rarely touch that. I will lower the highlights. I will open the shadows, which I did both on this photo. But that's not changing the exposure. That's just changing the brightness and the shadows. So on a scene like this, this one is one with the BLH factor. I'm going to bracket like hell. I'm going to try what the camera tells me. Then I'm going to try one darker. I'm going to try one lighter. I might try two darker. I might go 2 stops under. Some scenes like this are great for HDR. The laundry was blown in the wind a little too much for HDR. It would probably create some real craziness if I tried to put it together that way. So I didn't make an HDR shot of this. I just tried to do it in one exposure. But you know, when I'm not sure of the exposure, which is pretty frequently, I'm just going to shoot multiple pictures of multiple exposures. You know, in a scene like this where nothing's moving much, that's fine. You know, when I'm doing people photography, well, you know, I need to hit that exposure as soon as I can. You know, this is the perfect spot for spot metering. So his arm, his shoulder, or actually his pants and the floor, right where his foot is, are where I want to make sure my exposure is right. So my camera was telling me that I was about 2.5 stops too dark on this picture. And I'm like, yeah, I know better than that. So soon, you know, before I even put the camera up to my face, I said, I'm not even going to trust what the camera is telling me on this one, because it's going to try to make all that darkness bright. It wants that, you know, it wants everything to be a nice bright gray tone. And so soon as I pulled it up, I looked to see what the camera was telling me, and I just darkened the picture by 2.5 stops, and it came out pretty nice. You know, you're getting that nice light coming in the door there, and you know, if I was wanting to be precise and this is exposure-wise not changed at all in post-processing. I set the exposure mode on spot metering, like I said, and I'd either meter off the floor between his feet is about right, or off his right arm by his elbow would be pretty close to an 18% gray, or his hair, as far as that goes. So I might try all 3 of those and see what's it telling me. You know, is it saying that's 250 at f4 on the floor and 250 at or 180 at f4 on his arm and 180 on an f4 on his head? And then I'd probably go at 180 and try it, and then I'd bracket a little bit. But in a scene like this, I don't need to be exact. It was pretty close. So there are many times when we can't get a perfect exposure on everything that's in the scene. So when I saw this scene, I liked it right away. This guy, he's a little creepy. He has 12 wives and 25 kids, seriously, and another one on the way. And he was just a little creepy is the word. So when he sat down there and he pulled out this, he's filing his nails with literally a metal rasp, a file, you know, that you use on cars or something. And his hat, you know, his face was in shadow. If I wanted his face, I would have to brighten the exposure for the whole thing a whole lot, right? And that means that everything else is going to be way overexposed. So I kind of liked the way that he became a mystery man by being in the shadow there. So I made sure that my exposure was right for the entire scene and let his face go dark. If I did want to have his face and the rest of the scene properly exposed, can't do it in one shot unless, you know, pull out a strobe and a flash and pop that into his face, or use a reflector to reflect some light back up in there. Or you'd have to do an HDR shot and hope he doesn't move much. And you know, this would probably take 5 exposures to get light back up into his face there, because that's a very hard shadow. But I like it the way it is. You know, when I saw it, I knew I wasn't going to get anything other than darkness under his hat, and that was fine by me. So. But then when you hit some scenes, you know, that wall in the background is just a little bit lighter than 18% gray. So it was the exposure mode. My evaluative was telling me, make it darker, make it darker. And as soon as I looked at the picture on my camera, I said, nope, that's too dark. I'm going to brighten it up a little bit. So this is about a half stop brighter than what the camera told me. Now, what the camera told me would have been okay. I could have fixed that in post-processing, but I'd always rather have the proper exposure to start with than having to pull something out later. So this is another situation where the camera was saying, make it dark. It didn't like this building being light, so it wanted it darker. And I had to increase the exposure to get the detail up in the upper floors of the building. And so as soon as I shot one picture and I chimped it, I looked at it and I said, nope, that's not right. So I had to do some exposure compensation to it back. A lot of people talk about histograms and looking at histograms. I decided not to go into that very heavy tonight. I did that a couple of months, so I do have another video on my website about histograms. I rarely look at histograms. Every photo that you see will have a different looking histogram, and it doesn't tell you if the exposure is right. All a histogram will do is tell you if your shadows are too bright, or your shadows are too dark, or your highlights are too bright. It'll tell you if you're blowing out the highlights or clogging up the shadows. So if I'm not sure if I'm getting too bright and I'm losing my highlights, I'll look at the histogram for that. I'll never look at it for the bell curve to see how it's working out, how it's looking, because that doesn't tell me a thing. Histograms, you know, people will tell you they can read a histogram and tell you if it's a right exposure. They're blowing smoke, you know, they're blowing smoke, because a histogram is dependent on how many light or dark tones are in the scene. So a perfect, you know, the only time you have a perfect histogram is if you're shooting fog, then you have the perfect bell curve. Other than that, which way things are going, you know, you just can't tell. So you can't trust a histogram, except for highlights and shadows. Other than that, nothing. So this is one that, you know, I don't even look at what the meter's telling me, because I know it's not even going to be anywhere in the ballpark. You know, this is before sunrise. You know, it wants that water to be light. It doesn't want it to be dark. And so it's just gonna blow this whole scene out. So this is a 25-second exposure, and it probably would have told me it should be a 2-second exposure. So when I'm doing night shots and long exposures, I don't even look at the meter. I don't care. You know, I've shot enough things like this to know that, well, first of all, I want it to be a very long exposure so I can get the cars streaking by. But then it's just a matter of reviewing the pictures and seeing how they're looking and going from there. So I don't even try to let the meter help me on this one. because it's not going to be right. And if you look at the histogram on this, it's going to tell you that picture is just way, way, way too dark, because everything on the histogram is going to be pushed to the left. There'll be just a little line on the right side, but it's going to really, really mess you up. So sometimes the meter does you zero benefits, but most of the time, you know, you need it. You need it. I used to work with a guy who, you know, the old Nikons, the original Nikon F didn't have a light meter, and he swore he could lick his finger and hold it up in the air and tell what the light was. He hit them pretty often, but you know, it was amazing how if you shoot a lot, which means every day, you learn to see light, and you learn that there's not that many combinations of light, and for the most part, you really don't need a meter. You know, sunshine on a sunny day, you know, daylight on a sunny day, same exposure every day. If it's cloudy, then you have some problems, but you know, that takes a lot of work, and I don't shoot every day like I used to, so I can't do that anymore. I used to be able to just walk into a room and tell you what the exposure was, but not anymore. One of the fun things of getting old, I guess. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. Do we have any questions? Anybody has any thoughts? I can't see, I don't think, anybody write any questions? I can't see questions or comments online, so unfortunately.
May I ask a question?
A question?
Yeah. I always wanted to know what ISO does,
Okay.
and you know, when to change it. You know, because I usually shoot like at 100 or let the camera decide automatically. And I just
Okay.
wanted to know, you know, what it does and how it affects the outcome of the picture, and
Okay.
how to use it.
So ISO, so there are three things that control your exposure: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. All three are equally important. They're the exposure triangle. So you have all three of them are, like I say, equally important. If you have a proper exposure and you change one, you change your aperture, you either need to change your shutter speed or your ISO to maintain that proper exposure. So what ISO itself does is it controls the sensitivity of your sensor. So the lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. So at 100, it's 4 times less sensitive than at 400, 2 stops. So as you raise your ISO, you lower the quality of your photo. So you'll introduce noise, you'll get less colors, you'll get less dynamic range, meaning that ability to shoot from dark to lights. You get fewer tones in your picture. And so to get the highest quality, you should always shoot with the lowest possible ISO, the natural ISO. There are some fake ISOs. I forget what they call them. They're digitally enhanced ISOs. You don't want to go there ever. So if 100 is the lowest number, and then there's like L1 and L2, stay away from them. Some cameras it's 100, some cameras it's 200, some it's 64. It just depends on your camera. Auto ISO is the worst thing ever invented, because you've lost total control over the quality of your picture. Now, people will argue with me on that one, and I'll let them. On a lot of cameras, you can set the range of the auto ISO. So you can say, let it go from 100 to 800. If you've done a test with your ISO and shot a picture at 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, whatever, and you know at what point your pictures become so noisy that you don't want to ever go there again, then it's okay to set that auto ISO, 100 to my camera, it's 1600. If I go above 1600, the quality is just horrible. So, if I set it 100 to 800, I wouldn't worry about losing too much quality there. I'm going to lose quite a bit, but not, my main concern is I make huge prints. I make 60-inch, 72-inch prints. So I have to have the best quality possible. If I was only shooting to put on Facebook, can you see any difference between 100 and 800 on most cameras? Probably not. So, it depends what you're doing with the picture. So if you're changing your ISO frequently, you're just changing the sensitivity, and you're changing the relationship of the triangle. So if you're at f8 and 500th of a second, and you're at ISO 100, and you need to be at f16, or you want to be at f16 at 500th of a second, then you need to bump your ISO up to 400 and get those 2 stops that you're losing by controlling that. So I set my ISO at 100, and I just spent a little over a week in Cuba, and it didn't leave 100. About the only time I do switch off of 100 is, well, 2 things. If I'm hand holding a lot and I don't have my tripod, which is rare, or if I'm doing astrophotography. If I'm trying to shoot the stars, then it has to be up at 3200, and just to render an image. So that's when I change my ISO. Is that more than you ever bargained for, Jason?
No, it's very helpful. I appreciate the time you take.
Okay, you bet.
Lauren?
Other questions?
Lauren?
Yes.
Yeah, so just to touch upon what he said, is basically a good rule of thumb is basically what you're saying is set it at 100 if you're not messing around, but it basically depends if you're putting it on the tripod or handheld. If you're doing handheld with 200, 300, is that where you want to be?
Yeah, 400 maybe. 400 gets you a 2 full stops of shutter speed or aperture. So, most cameras look pretty darn good at 400. It's when you start getting above, and it depends on, it's one of the things, the newer the camera, probably the better the high ISO it does. So, if you have a 10-year-old camera and you're shooting at 800, it's going to be pretty noisy. If you just got one of the newer cameras, you might not even see a difference until you make a huge print from difference between 100 and 800. So my recommendation is find something, put your camera on a tripod, put it on aperture priority, find something colorful, shoot a picture at ISO 100, aperture priority, then at 200, then at 400 and 800 and 1600 and 3200, then put them in the computer, take a look at them and see, hey, that looks pretty good at 800. Oh, it's starting to look bad at 1600. Oh, it looks horrible at 32. So I don't want to shoot at 3200 again. So it's just, it's personal preference.
Hey, Lauren, Jim Collymore here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, that picture you had of the church, I was wondering, it's faster, I understand, to use the exposure control in the camera, but when you've got a static image like that, could you have used a neutral density filter, and would have it had a significantly different effect?
So what a neutral density filter does is it lets less light come into the lens. That's all. So it lets, so in any scene, it's not going to change the scene. It's only going to change how much light is coming into the scene. And it's going to affect the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows the same. So if you put a 4-stop neutral density on, it's going to make the highlights 4 stops darker. It's going to make the midtones 4 stops darker. It's going to make the shadows 4 stops darker. So it is not going to do a thing other than, the time you use a neutral density filter is if you want to have a slower shutter speed, usually. So I was out this morning shooting snow here in Vermont, and I was shooting a river. And so I broke out the 8-stop neutral density so I could get a 5-second exposure. So the water moving would become a blur. It doesn't do a thing for color, doesn't do a thing for the scene's really bright or the scene's really contrasty. Doesn't change any of that. It's neutral, and that's why it's called neutral. Now they do make colored ones, but same thing you can do in post-processing. So there's no benefit to having them.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Did I confuse anybody?
Loren, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you ever use the blinkies on your meter? You know, in terms of.
Yes.
Okay,
So
so you want to talk about that a little bit?
Thank you. Yes. So most cameras you can set up to tell you when you're overexposing the highlights, and it's called the blinkies, and it will literally have in the places that are too bright a blink. It'll flash black dots at you. Yes, I do set that up, and so when you're reviewing your picture, you can tell right away, ooh, that's too bright. Now, the thing you need to learn though is that's not the same on all cameras. And so sometimes on some cameras, and you have to learn where this is, when it's telling you that you're overexposed, you're not really. It's kind of confusing. So you can take a picture that you shot and the blinkies are going crazy, bring it into Lightroom or Photoshop, and you still have detail in the whites. So you have to kind of learn where that point is. So again, an example, this morning I was shooting snow. The camera was telling me, the exposure meter was telling me, this is your exposure. When I shot it, it was gray. The snow was gray. I don't want gray snow, I want white snow. So I had to overexpose it. When it's cloudy out, that usually is about 2 stops. So of course, if it's 2 stops, I go 2.5, right? When I went 2.5, I started getting the blinkies in some of the brighter parts of the picture. So I kept shooting the blinkies, but then I would back off my exposure by 1/3 of a stop till I got to the point where I was just losing the blinkies. And I know with my camera that at that point that I just start losing the blinkies. If I go back up 1/3 of a stop, it'll start blinking, but when I put them into Lightroom, it's going to be fine. So I've learned where my break point is on the blinkies. But if you turn on the blinkies, and every camera it's different, and it's called they don't call it blinkies in any menu. It's called what the hell do they call it even? Everybody calls it something different, but it's highlight what? Highlight warnings, some call it. So look for something called highlight something or other, and it'll tell you highlight alert. Some cameras call it. It'll alert you when your highlights are too bright. Now there's no equal thing on the dark side. You know, there's no blinkies for underexposure, just the overexposure. Now blinkies aren't always bad. If you get you know, if you're taking a picture and the sun's in the picture, probably that's going to be overexposed, and the blinkies are going to go nuts on the sun itself. Well, you're not going to get the proper exposure on the sun ever. So that's okay. Or if you have a spectral highlight coming, you know, if you're photographing a car and you get a real bright reflection, a spectral highlight, that's going to show up as a blinky, and also in your histogram, it's going to show up if they're too bright. Well, you can't get rid of a spectral highlight on a little highlight like that. So the blinkies are a good thing to know are there, and yeah, I leave them turned on, and but I know where they're lying to me too.
So a quick question, Loren, to follow up, which is, what happens when you over or blow the highlights? What happens when you're trying to process it in your, you know, in Lightroom?
Right. So if your highlights, so say what do I have? Anything white on my hair? My hair is too white. If I overexpose that and it's too white, I lose all the detail. And so when I try to go into Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever and darken that back down, there's no detail there for it to pick up any color, any tone at all. So it will just punch in gray, and it looks really bad. Looks really, really bad. So what you lose is detail in the highlights. And so if you remember the picture of the woman with the colorful dress on and holding the cigar against a white wall, if I made that picture too bright, I would lose all the texture in that white wall behind her. And then it would become just this white blob. So, you know, I have to be careful with that. So I want to not lose that detail in the highlight, because your eye naturally goes to the brightest part of the picture. So if you're just absolutely blowing out detail, it's really tough. You can't bring it back. You know, you just can't bring it back.
Great explanation, Alan.
Thank you for prompting me on that.
Loren, if you're in center weight exposure,
Yes.
can you set up your picture where you want the exposure, but then move your camera so that you may move it to the other third of the frame?
Yes, you can. If you push your shutter button halfway down, it will
Right.
usually take that's when it takes the exposure reading. And if you keep holding it halfway down and then recompose, it will hold that exposure. But that's a real pain, because if you shoot 5 pictures, you have to do that 5 times. Some cameras have a button on the back that exposure hold button. So you can just push that button and hold it. But what I recommend doing is taking that meter reading the way you say, and then pay attention to what it's saying. So if it's saying it's 250 at f8, and then you move it over and you recompose, and now it's saying it should be a 60th at 2.8. Well, then you just jump into your exposure compensation and bump it up 2 stops, 3 stops to go 2 stops from 60th to 250. So that, you know, that way you don't have to recompose every time, and you can just, now again, if it's a moving subject, yeah, you know, you might not have time to do that. But if it's just a general scene, you know.
Okay, that's a good suggestion.
That makes sense?
It does, absolutely.
And I apologize for that.
Hi, this is Nistalia. So I have a question. What is the difference between zebra exposure and the blinkies? Is it the same, or is it completely different one?
Say that to me again.
Sorry, I'm using a Sony camera. So in my settings, I can see something called like zebra. If I turn it on, those the variations, and like, what is the difference between zebra and blinkies? Which
zebra traditionally is for video. So video guys use that all the time. And a zebra you can set up to be at different brightnesses. So it could be at 75% brightness, the zebras start coming on. It could be 85%, could be 90%, or it could be 100%. So most zebra warnings are controllable. I don't know of a camera that you can control at what density the blinkies start. So my guess, and I don't know the Sony camera that well, that would be the difference. On a video camera, that's what it would be. And so the look on the back of the screen, the reason they call it zebra striping is because it has a black and white pattern that just kind of flows down across the picture where it's too bright. Whereas the blinkies just have a black dot that flash on and off. Doing essentially the same thing, but you know, stick to the blinkies. Simpler.
Thank you.
Sure.
If you're taking a photo of a silhouette, you know, like in the church, do you expose them for the church and not for the silhouette, for the people in front?
Exactly. Yes. So you're essentially exposing for the background and letting the person in the foreground go dark, go black. Exactly.
Thank you.
So in that case, you know, if I had a zoom lens on, which I always do, I might zoom in and get my exposure without having the person in the picture. So maybe right over the top of their head, if the whole background is pretty much the same, and figure out what the exposure is there, then zoom back out. That way the silhouette silhouetted person doesn't become a factor in the camera determining what that exposure should be or could be. Recommend it anyway.
So would you be doing evaluative then? If you're exposing for the background, would you be using
Yeah.
What would you be using? Evaluative, center, spot?
Probably the center weight. That way you just
weight?
zoom right in on what your background is, and you don't have to worry about things on the outside affecting the exposure recommendation.
Thank you.
But I just want to be clear. I never changed mine. In fact, I had to go look to see what it was set on because I didn't know. So because I don't believe it so often that it doesn't matter to me. But again, that's partially experience, partially control freak. Other thoughts, questions? Damn, I'm good. Anything else, anybody?
Hi, Loren, this is Matthew. Can you hear me?
Hi, Matthew.
Hi. I have a quick question. Do you have any comments on exposure when shooting black and white versus color?
Then I really want to make sure I don't blow up my highlights. And I mean, for me, the beauty of black and white is drama of the shadows. I say this all the time. I love to have a black when I'm doing black and white. So I want to make sure that my exposure is making sure that my blacks stay black and I don't overexpose. So I tend to underexpose my black and white when I'm thinking black and white an awful lot. But in general, it's pretty much the same. But I just really want to make sure I'm maintaining my my blacks and getting that highlight under control.
Great, thanks. And one other comment I want to make.
Sure.
For years, I've always been erring on the side of underexposing against a lot of, suggestions that I've gotten from other people. And I really, thank you for reiterating that approach, because so many of my photos, I've done like multiple shots of the same thing. And had I not underexposed at least one or two of them, I would have totally lost what I was trying to capture. So I really appreciate that you have the same approach, that I've been following.
Good. Good. So while we're all locked up in our houses, I want to do quite a few of these. So if you have any topics that you would love to chat about, please just drop me an email and make suggestions. This is a pretty rough time, and I think photography is a great way to get through it. And the more we play, and the more we know, and the more fun we'll have, and being able to document what's going on right now is I think pretty important, both from a historical perspective and a sanity perspective. One of the things I'm thinking about doing, and this kind of came to me this afternoon, I haven't even started really working on it, is photographing my neighbors through their window. I'm going to make not leering in there, but make a little sign saying, this is what I'm doing, hold it up to the window when I see somebody, and can I take a picture of you through the window? And I'll include the window in the picture, as a framing device. But I think that might be kind of fun. I hope I don't creep too many people out, but I might, who knows? Just little things like that, just to get out and walk around a little bit and not go in the house, but be able to photograph people, because I have a feeling people will be looking out the windows quite a bit. So if you can come up with a project to
just make sure they're dressed.
Right, yeah, I won't put her dressed. But if you can come up with a project that has you, gives you a good reason to pick up the camera, I think that'll be very important to us here for the next
Hey,
few
Loren,
days.
Somebody in my neighborhood is doing portraits. So people can sign up and they'll sit on their porch, and she's going to go by and do portraits of them and then send it to them, via email.
Yeah, that's cool.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that too. Yeah.
Hey, Loren, so a small suggestion. I was planning to do a water drop photography. So any suggestions on that? Like what is the picture, shutter speed I should use, and exposure on that?
Ooh. So the hard part with water drops is timing. And if you don't have a device, you'll be frustrated beyond belief. So your shutter speed has to be the fastest possible. But what really freezes the motion of water drops is the flash. So if you don't have an external flash, it's, I won't say it's impossible, but damn is it hard. So if you have an external flash, you need to put it on manual mode and dial the power down to 1/28 power, so it makes a really short duration flash. But if you don't have a device to control the timing on that, it'll make you nuts, because just timing the water drop hitting is crazy. So, but I mean, spend a couple hours trying, and as long as you don't have expectations of getting something, you'll have some fun, but you might not get anything. I'll just warn you.
That's fun. I just wanted to have fun and kill some time.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good challenge. It's a good challenge, but it'll be tough. So the exposure is purely dependent on your flash and what light you're using. But if you're just trying to do it with shutter speed, you need to use the absolute fastest shutter speed that you have on your camera, whatever that is, 1/4000th of a second. If you're using a little handheld flash and you can dial the power down to 1/28 power, it'll be an effective shutter speed of about 1/30,000th of a second, which is a big difference.
So mine shows 1/8000 is the fastest shutter I can go with.
Yeah. Yeah, you try it. Yeah. Love to see what happens when you get that.
Sure. Thank you.
Loren, this is Matthew again. One other comment, one thing I wanted to share with everyone. I live in Brooklyn, which is normally very crowded. Since all of this started, I've been going out almost every day on my bike. The roads are empty. I can bike along, not getting close to anyone. There aren't buses and trucks and crowds in the way. I'm seeing all kinds of things that I never was able to see in photograph. And I've gotten so many great urban shots in the last week that I never would have gotten under other circumstances. So anyone, who's in a similar environment to mine, definitely take advantage of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Just stay away from everybody, Matthew. You're right.
No, if I'm out on the road 6 feet away, I'm fine. And,
yeah.
I've just been getting so many great shots.
That's cool. Okay, if there are no further questions, we'll adjourn. I am doing some Lightroom classes next week online, so if you're wanting to either brush up or really learn Lightroom, I'm doing some classes. That is a paid one. I've got to find some way to pay the bills here for these few days, but I'm working on coming up with other topics to do these webinars. So, like I say, if you have any suggestions, love to hear them. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Loren.
Be well.
Thank you, Loren.
Thanks, Loren.
Thank you, Loren.
Thank you.
Thank you.